France, 778 AD. The pass of Roncevaux in the Pyrenees Mountains. The air is thin and cold, and the sound of dying men echoes off rock walls that have stood since before anyone in this army was born. A rearguard of Charlemagne's army is being slaughtered by Basque fighters who materialize from the mountain slopes with the precision of men who know every ridge and every shadow in their own territory. The wagons are burning, the horses are screaming. The rearguard is cut off from the main army ahead of it and from any possibility of rescue behind it. The commander of the rearguard is a young knight named Roland. He is the most famous warrior in the Frankish world, the bravest, the most reckless. The man who carries a sword called Durendal and an ivory horn called Oliphant, and who refuses to blow that horn to summon help because blowing it would mean admitting that he cannot win alone. By the time he finally raises the horn to his lips and blows, the sound splitting the mountain air with a cry that reaches Charlemagne miles ahead, it is too late. Roland dies in the pass with his face toward the enemy and his sword beneath his body so that no one can take it from him. This is the story the Song of Roland tells, the most celebrated epic poem of medieval Europe, the foundation of the chivalric tradition, the text that defined heroism for 500 years. The poem identifies Roland as Charlemagne's nephew, his sister's son. The word nephew appears in the text with an emphasis and a frequency that exceeds what the narrative requires. Roland is the nephew, always the nephew. The poem insists on this word, the way a man insists on a locked door when he knows what is behind it. For 1,000 years, the word was taken at face value. Roland was Charlemagne's nephew. The relationship was familial but simple. Uncle and sister's son, a bond of blood but not of scandal. Then scholars began examining the literary traditions that fed into the Song of Roland, the older oral traditions, the Italian chanson de geste, the fragmentary sources that a poem's authors drew on when they composed the version that survived. What they found behind the word nephew was a tradition so disturbing that the poets who preserved it had encrypted the truth in the only code available to them. A word that meant one thing on the surface and another thing entirely to those who understood what medieval literary convention used it to conceal. Roland, the great hero of French literature, the paragon of knightly virtue, may not have been Charlemagne's nephew at all. He may have been Charlemagne's son, not by a wife, not by a concubine, by his own sister. The relationship that the poem encodes beneath the word nephew is a relationship between brother and sister that produced a child who became a hero who became a legend, and a legend that was built on a secret so devastating that the men who wrote it down buried the truth inside a single word and trusted that no one would dig it up. Someone did. And what the excavation revealed about Charlemagne, about what he did to the women of his own family, about the private life that the most powerful man in Christendom conducted behind the walls of the most celebrated court in Europe, has been erased from every textbook and every classroom that teaches the story of the father of Europe, Charlemagne. The name means Charles the Great. Like Alexander before him, the adjective has been attached so long that it functions as a label rather than a judgment. You learned about him in school, the wise Christian emperor, the patron of learning who gathered scholars from across Europe and sparked the Carolingian Renaissance, the unifier who forged the warring barbarian kingdoms into something resembling civilization for the first time since Rome fell, the man crowned emperor of the Romans by the Pope on Christmas Day of 800 AD, a moment that every European history textbook presents as the birth of Western Christendom. The image on the playing card, the King of Hearts in a French deck, is Charlemagne. The image in the cathedral, he was canonized, and his relics are venerated in Aachen to this day. Pilgrims visit, tourists photograph. The story of the father of Europe is carved into stone and painted onto glass and printed into the curriculum of every school that teaches Western civilization as a narrative of progress from darkness into light. The reality was more complicated than the playing card. Charlemagne was a man of extraordinary contradictions. He promoted literacy, but was barely literate himself, Einhard noting that the emperor tried to learn to write late in life and never fully succeeded. He championed Christianity but conducted a private life that violated its most fundamental moral codes. He built the most powerful empire in post-Roman Europe while maintaining a household so transgressive that his own biographer, a man who lived at court and knew the family personally, struggled visibly with how to describe it. Einhard. The name matters because the man matters. Einhard wrote the Vita Caroli Magni, the life of Charlemagne, the single most important biography of any medieval monarch. He was not a distant historian working from second-hand sources. He was a member of Charlemagne's inner circle. He knew the family. He attended the meals. He walked the corridors. He saw what happened inside the palace at Aachen, and he made decisions, careful, deliberate, politically sophisticated decisions about what to include in his biography and how to include it. What Einhard chose to write about Charlemagne's daughters is a masterpiece of controlled revelation. He included enough to preserve the truth. He obscured enough to protect the reputation. And he trusted that future readers would understand the difference between what he said and what he meant, the way a man trusts that someone will eventually find the message he has hidden inside a bottle and thrown into the sea. If you want to understand what Einhard buried in his biography, or the Song of Roland encrypted in a single word, what happened to the women of Charlemagne's family behind the walls of the most powerful court in Christendom, then subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that subscribe button because what I'm about to reveal has been managed and suppressed and filed away in academic Latin for 12 centuries. Stay until the end because the final chapter of Charlemagne's story involves what was done with his body after death, and it is stranger and more disturbing than anything the legend of the father of Europe was designed to let you imagine. Charlemagne was born in 742, the eldest son of Pepin the Short, the first Carolingian king of the Franks. When Pepin died in 768, the kingdom was divided between Charlemagne and his younger brother Carloman. The division lasted 3 years. In 771, Carloman died suddenly. The circumstances were convenient enough that historians have debated their nature for 12 centuries. Charlemagne absorbed his brother's kingdom immediately, before Carloman's young sons could mount a claim. The widow and children fled to the court of the Lombard king in Italy. Charlemagne would conquer the Lombards 3 years later. The family disappeared from the historical record. Charlemagne's path to sole power was cleared by a death that arrived at exactly the right moment. It would not be the last time. He conquered with a methodical relentlessness that his contemporaries found both impressive and terrifying. The Lombards fell in 774. The Saxons resisted for 30 years and were broken through a combination of military campaigns and forced mass conversions that included the execution of 4,500 Saxon prisoners in a single day at Verdun in 780. 2. The Avars were destroyed, and their treasury, the accumulated wealth of 2 centuries of raiding, was seized and distributed among Charlemagne's followers. The Bavarians were absorbed. By 800, when Pope Leo III placed the imperial crown on his head in Rome, Charlemagne ruled an empire stretching from the Pyrenees to the Elbe, from the North Sea to central Italy. He was the most powerful man in the Western world, and power of that magnitude operated without external restraint. No one told Charlemagne what he could not do. No institution checked his behavior. No court reviewed his decisions. The church needed him more than he needed the church. The nobles depended on him for their lands and titles. The scholars he patronized repaid his generosity with flattery that reinforced his sense of himself as divinely appointed and therefore beyond the rules that governed ordinary men. His appetites were enormous and they were public. The sources document 5 wives. Himiltrude, the mother of his eldest son Pepin the Hunchback, whom Charlemagne later set aside. The unnamed Lombard princess, married for political alliance and discarded within a year. Hildegard, who bore him 9 children before dying at 25. Fastrada, whom the sources describe as cruel. Luitgard, who died before Charlemagne. After Luitgard's death, he did not marry again. He took concubines instead. At least 4 are named in the sources. The children accumulated, 18 at minimum, by various women, a count that reflects only the ones the sources bother to record. In Frankish culture, a king's virility was not a private matter. It was evidence of fitness to rule. A king who produced many children demonstrated the vitality that God had invested in his bloodline. The court did not hide Charlemagne's appetites. It celebrated them. What the court could not celebrate, what Einhard could barely bring himself to describe, was the direction those appetites took when they turned inward, toward his own blood, toward the women who shared his name and his household, and who could not refuse him, because refusal required a power that no woman in the Frankish world possessed against the man who ruled it. Charlemagne had a sister. The sources name her variously as Gisela or Gilen, depending on which tradition is consulted. She was younger than Charlemagne. She appears in the official historical record with a brevity that is itself a form of evidence. In a court that documented everything, that recorded the gifts given to visiting ambassadors and the weight of bread loaves sold in the imperial markets, the emperor's own sister occupies a space so small that her near absence can only be deliberate. Someone decided that Gisela would not be written about. Someone ensured that the records that might have described her life at court in detail either were not created or did not survive. The silence around her is not the silence of insignificance. It is the silence of management. What survives comes from the margins. The literary traditions that fed into the great epic cycles of medieval French and Italian poetry, the chansons de geste, the songs of deeds, that were composed from oral traditions older than the written versions by centuries. These traditions contain a story about Charlemagne and his sister that the official court histories do not contain, a story so consistent across multiple independent sources and multiple literary traditions that dismissing it as pure invention requires ignoring the pattern that connects them. The story is this. Charlemagne and his sister had a relationship that went beyond what any brother and sister should share. The relationship produced a child, a son. The son was raised at court under a designation that concealed his true parentage. He was called the emperor's nephew. He grew up to become the most celebrated warrior in the Frankish world.